Beginning in the early 1600s, many people in England began to hear of a massive landmass just across the pond called North America. This land was sparsely populated, meaning that it provided a nice clean slate for a nice new life. These benefits enticed many people to settle it. Being subjects of the English crown, they were in luck because the king set fairly relaxed rules for them. Privileges were enjoyed and everyone was pretty happy for a while. One of the most important privileges was the privilege to own guns, something that would come in handy when a conflict broke out with the French. This was a pretty easy victory for England, but the cost was incredibly high. No worries. The king has a brilliant idea. Tax the settlers. These privileges they enjoyed were now taken away and taxes were put on many important goods. These settlers now wondered why they should let a fat king with dumb clothes tell them what to do. Luckily for them, but unluckily for the rest of the world, they had guns to protect their rights. Taking away their privileges and imposing tariffs caused tensions, but when the British attempted to take away the settlers' guns, an army was assembled to protect them. With much foreign aid, this army won and decided to establish an independent nation in 1783. And so, with the stroke of a pen, the United States was born. However, these so-called United States were divided on a particular issue, slavery. While writing the laws of this new nation, the issue of slavery was brought up. Many southern states lacked the local labor to run their large plantations, so they relied on cheap workers imported from Africa. The writers of the Constitution saw the immorality of humans being a commodity to be bought and sold, but also the economic necessity of it. Eventually, the issue was settled and slavery was deemed morally acceptable, with slaves being considered only 3/5 of a human being. However, this issue refused to go away, continuing to cause divide for decades. Beginning in the early 1800s, many Americans began to hear of a land of opportunity nicknamed the West. The US expanded into previously Native American territories, and the country almost doubled in size with the Louisiana Purchase from France. Soon, President James K. Polk would make a truly remarkable discovery. Mexico exists. That was strictly banned by the 532nd Amendment, so something had to be done. As it turns out, the 532nd Amendment didn't actually exist, but what did exist was the Mexican-American War. In reality, this conflict was really over before it even started. The Mexican army had been unable to defeat guerrilla rebels in Texas. They definitely were not going to beat an industrialized and modern US military. After the Americans destroyed what weak defenses protected Mexico City, they enforced peace on their terms. US westward expansion was complete. As the United States grew larger, so too did the conflict between Southern slavery and Northern abolitionism. With the invention of the cotton gin in 1794, the cotton industry boomed in the South, fueled by a rise in slave labor. The North and the South eventually grew into two separate cultures, economies, and, soon enough, two different nations. The US Senate and Congress were for a while kept in a good balance between slave and free states. Most of the Western territories, however, abolished slavery, upsetting the delicate stability. This allowed the North to impose regulations such as banning the import of slaves from Africa, but the slave trade within the South would continue. Laws like this were passed under the idea that if slavery was limited, it would eventually die out. A couple failed compromises later, and the 1860 election was right around the corner. This election was mainly between the liberal Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln and the conservative Democratic candidate John Breckinridge. Abraham Lincoln was staunchly against slavery and was popular with northern states, managing to win a landslide victory against Breckinridge. For southern states, many of whom didn't even put Lincoln as a voting option, this was the tipping point. A movement for southern secession from the Union spread like wildfire in slave states. Many slave owners felt that Lincoln was going to advocate for the total abolition of slavery, despite him never saying anything about such a move. Beginning in December 1860, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina all left the Union. Instead, they joined the newly created Confederate States of America, with the capital being in Richmond, Virginia. Without a doubt, a war was soon to come. Looking at the numbers on the onset of this war, the Union has a massive advantage. It had a much higher population, especially considering half the Confederate population was slaves, as well as a massive industry. Despite this fact, the South still managed to put up a fair fight. How did they do this, even though they were at such a disadvantage? The Confederates had a couple of things going for them. First of all, the South wanted this war. Southerners felt that their livelihood was being threatened, and that turned out to be a pretty good call to arms. Despite what some may say, the driving cause for the South was to keep slavery. The North, however, was fighting a war to keep some some sort of Union life, and that just wasn't as convincing. Every defeat they suffered, it was another reason the war wasn't worth it, as well as a stain on Lincoln's reputation. In addition, the Confederacy had a lot of influential people. The cotton and tobacco plantations made many millionaires, meaning there were powerful people fighting for secession. The same gun rights policy that allowed the US to become independent would also almost tear it apart, as the South was allowed to arm itself. The CSA state Virginia also had some of the best military schools in the country, giving the Confederates access to some of the finest commanders of the time. After announcing their secession from the Union, southern states began seizing U.S. property, particularly forts in South Carolina. The spark was finally lit when negotiations broke down regarding a certain Fort Sumter, with the CSA eventually bombarding the stronghold into submission. After this incident, both the Union and the Confederacy began to rally soldiers. The Arizona territories as well as Oklahoma actually did join the Confederacy, feeling that they were being forgotten, but they were pretty forgettable to be honest and didn't actually have any impact. Some border states such as Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky were against leaving the Union, but also against fighting for it, so they tried to remain neutral. The stage was finally set for a massive conflict. The initial phases of the war can be divided into two fronts, the East in the state of Virginia and the West in the state of everything that not is Virginia. The Eastern Front was very crucial to the war. Both capitals were located in fairly close proximity, meaning a decisive move here could end the war quickly. The terrain generally favored the South, with the Shenandoah Valley hindering Union offensives. U.S. troops almost immediately began advancing, and they met the Confederates on July 21, 1861 at Bull Run. This was a decisive victory for the CSA Army led by Stonewall Jackson. The battle surprised the Union and was a huge blow to morale. A pattern began to appear. Union armies almost always outnumbered the Confederates, but lacked the competent officers, organization, and same boldness that the Southerners had, putting them at a disadvantage. U.S. General McClellan was assigned to command the Union Army in the East. However, he suffered from being indecisive and was unwilling to take any risks. This weakness caused him to suffer a major defeat against Confederate General Robert E. Lee in the Peninsula Campaign during 1862. Lee, motivated by this victory, decided to strike into Union territory in an attempt to surround Washington, D.C. But this time, McClellan had a stroke of luck as one of his soldiers found Lee's battle plans. With this knowledge, he was able to win a bloody victory at the Battle of Antietam. After this decisive victory, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by Abraham Lincoln, freeing slaves in the rebel states. The Union now had a new cause for the war, and many African Americans decided to join the fight for their freedom. Despite this, the Union was horribly defeated at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862 after attempting a fearless charge. Continuing the pattern, U.S. General Joseph Hooker was beaten decisively by Lee at Chancellorsville despite outnumbering the Confederates 2-1. While the battle was considered a tactical masterpiece by Lee, the South also had a major loss. General Stonewall Jackson, who it turned out was not actually made of a stone wall, died from friendly fire as Confederate troops got scared when he approached their lines. The Western Front near the Mississippi would end up going much better for the Union. The Anaconda strategy of blockading Confederate ports worked incredibly well, however some European nations were upset with not receiving Southern cotton. Great Britain even considered intervention on the side of the Confederacy, but after the Battle of Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation they decided to back down. The Union devised a plan to take the Mississippi River from the Confederacy as it was a vital transportation link. They began moving up from Louisiana and captured the important city of New Orleans. The U.S. then repelled a Confederate invasion of Kentucky, and therefore the state stopped being neutral. A similar campaign happened in Missouri. Pro-Southern splinter governments were technically set up in both states, but for most of the war they had little land or public support. In return, the Union invaded Tennessee and easily captured important forts and cities. U.S. General Ulysses S. Grant, also nicknamed Unconditional Surrender Grant for only accepting unconditional surrender, became one of the most successful generals in the West. He proved his skills at the Battle of Shiloh, managing to win a major victory despite falling into a difficult ambush. Soon, most of the Mississippi was in Union hands, with Vicksburg being the last Confederate stronghold. With the situation in the West getting more and more desperate, Confederate President Jefferson Davis wanted Lee to move his army there and fix it. Lee, however, instead insisted on another invasion into the Union, this time directed at the industrial centers in the Northeast. He moved quickly through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, but met a U.S. army led by George Meade at Gettysburg on July 1, 1863. On the first day, the battle went well for Lee as he smashed through a disorganized Union defense, but on the second day it soon became a stalemate as both armies got into formation. Spare a few minor attacks, nothing really happened until until on the third day Lee gambled on a massive charge in the center. This was known as Pickett's Charge. As it turns out, having your essentially naked men do a suicidal charge against a well-fortified enemy with large guns and artillery isn't such a good idea. It was an absolute disaster, and the battle ended in a Union victory, with the Confederates having to go on a horrible retreat back to friendly territory. On the 4th of July, Vicksburg fell to Grant's army in the west. National morale was finally going up. At a memorial for the soldiers lost at Gettysburg, Lincoln gave one of the most famous speeches in U.S. history, the Gettysburg Address. Here he referred back to the Constitution and how it guaranteed liberty and rights for all, no matter what race or ethnic background, redefining the cause of this war. The tide had turned. Union forces tried to push deep into the Confederacy, but were defeated at Chickamauga and besieged at Chattanooga. Grant's army, however, managed to relieve the surrounded troops, leaving the door open for further offensives. Around this time, he was promoted to being commander of all U.S. armies. From here, Grant decided that his expertise was most needed in the East, where he would fight a bloody campaign against Lee's army. In the West, he was replaced by William Tecumseh Sherman, someone who was greatly offended by the Southern secession. His solution? Screw it, just burn everything. And that he did. He besieged and captured Atlanta, Georgia in July 1864, helping Lincoln win a second term against McClellan in November that same year. The Confederate economy, already struggling, was crippled by Sherman's march through Georgia, where he burned and destroyed roads, plantations, civilian property, and pretty much everything he found. This march was especially surprising, considering it was done with the Union stretching her supply lines. In the end, they made it to Savannah, Georgia, once again seeing the Atlantic Ocean. By this point, the South began to resort to guerrilla warfare. As for the East, Grant spent much of 1864 fighting battles against Lee and wearing both armies down. Eventually, Grant managed to besiege Lee at Petersburg in southern Virginia, and both sides began to dig trenches. This siege would last 10 months, from June 1864 to April 1865, and it was not a typical siege as both armies moved around often. Eventually, the Union Army cut off most of the Confederate supply lines, so Lee decided to abandon Petersburg as well as the capital Richmond, moving to Appomattox Courthouse. From here, he fought a short battle but soon realized that all hope was lost. He surrendered his entire army, with it surrendering any chance of a Southern victory. The last few Florida men still willing to fight for the Confederate cause were soon taken care of. The war was over and Union had been restored. After the Civil War, much of the South had to be reconstructed, and thus began the Reconstruction era. The main goals of Reconstruction were to politically reintegrate the southern states into the U.S., as well as to ensure the rights of newly freed African Americans. There were a lot of tensions between the white population and freed men. The Jim Crow laws, under the idea that people could be classified as separate but equal, enforced segregation and did their best to distance these people from everyday society. Understandably, welcoming a group of people who really have no money, no job, and no social position into everyday life comes with problems. The U.S. Civil War soon became one of the most popular topics in American history. For quite some time, the historical memory of this war was dominated by the Southern perspective, but recently more diverse views have emerged. This was one of the very first industrialized wars. Neither side truly expected it to be as big as it was. When the first battle came at Bull Run, there were onlookers watching as if it were some kind of movie. Soon, the reality set in that this was to be a long, bloody, and extremely brutal war of attrition. Both sides were guilty of using outdated, often Napoleonic-era tactics such as marching in close formations without cover, and these mistakes would prove to be devastating in battles such as Gettysburg and Fredericksburg. Naval combat was also revolutionized with inventions such as ironclads and submarines seeing their first usage. The history of aerial warfare largely begins here, as this was the first time balloons played a role, mainly in reconnaissance. On top of combat-related innovation, there were also large developments in the production front. Total war strategies were implemented in operations such as the March through Georgia, and civilian property was mobilized for the war effort. Mass production as well as the usage of trains, modern rifles, and the telegraph meant that the two sides in this war were truly using everything they had. Ultimately, this struggle was not between two armies, but between two nations. Important lessons were learned around the world, and they would be kept in mind for the major wars to come. Abraham Lincoln was a pretty odd president. Being as tall as about 427 Burj Khalifas, and basically 50% man, 50% top hat, he definitely had his looks down, especially considering his rival looked like a goat. As for his actual presidency, that was fairly odd as well. He spent his entire time in office trying to unite the country, siding with moderate political factions and being sympathetic to ex-Confederates. At the same time, he saw it through its biggest divide ever. By issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, he ensured the freedom of millions and started the path to civil rights in the US. Yet he was also the closest thing America ever had to a dictator, taking complete control of the war effort and imprisoning thousands for suspected Southern sympathy. As for his military strategy, that was half and half as well. Like many others, he wrongly underestimated the Confederate threat and often naively hoped for a quick, decisive victory. He also made many good decisions, such as putting faith in Ulysses Grant, whereas others discredited him for his drinking habit. Whilst not perfect by any metric, Lincoln was an honest and respectable man, ultimately being considered one of the nation's finest presidents. Unfortunately, on April 15, 1865, he was shot at Ford's Theater by Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth, ending his life at age 56. Both Lee and Grant were fairly good generals, but who was really better? Lee was an expert tactical commander. He was able to read the minds of his opponents and use it to his advantage. In addition, he made bold moves and was willing to take risks. This matched well with the fact they had many war-hardy veterans in his army. These strengths helped him defeat massive enemy forces at absurd odds. Grant, on the other hand, was patient, a little bit less bold, yet a careful planner. His best ability was to see the bigger picture and be able to think about the entire war rather than the battle. That's why he performed so much better than other Union generals who didn't push their strategic advantage as much, instead hoping for victory in one quick battle. During Grant's campaign in Virginia, he suffered terrible losses to Lee several times. However, he used his numerical superiority and unwillingness to retreat to eventually wear down and defeat his opponent. Obviously, none of them compared to Sherman. Just burn your enemy. What a strategy.